Okay, so with this particular plan of a typical Greek peripteral temple, the earliest temples were typically longer and narrower, with the proportion of the ends to the sides at a ratio of 1:3. But the newer ones change and actually become a proportion of 1:2. So they're a little bit more squat. They're not as narrow. This particular example is an example of an early temple, so it is narrow. So the short end could probably fit into the long end close to 3 times, if not 3 times. And figural sculpture was employed on the exterior of the Greek temple and was used to decorate it, but also to tell something about the deity represented within the temple walls. And it also served as a votive offering, so that sculptural element that was in the pediments was also a votive offering to the god. And Greek temples held a really important place in public life, and they were actually oftentimes built on top of hills or elevated sites around major cities, and they typically were built on an acropolis, which means in Greek high city. So acropolises are typically higher hills near larger cities with temples contained within them. And most of the sculptural ornament was on the upper part of the building in the frieze and pediments, and we'll kind of go over the areas of the temple here. So this is the kind of the example of the Doric and Ionic orders. These are the 2 orders that were used in Greek temple building. The 2 styles, I guess, you can call them styles too, but they call it the Doric order and the Ionic order. And typically the painted reliefs were put in, like I said, the pediment area or on the frieze area here. So the pediment is triangular shape, and it was put in both orders. Those were where, they put sculpture. But I'd have to say in the Doric order, they only placed the sculpture in the frieze because in this area, which was called the metope. So it was a little different in the Doric order. They only put sculptural elements in the metope area. And this, in the Ionic order of the frieze, it was completely open, so they would fill the whole thing with sculpture in the Ionic order. So the 2 orders did differ a little bit as to where they might have placed sculpture. And the Ionic temples sometimes completely replaced the column with women figures, basically, and that was called a caryatid. And we'll see some examples of that in the Ionic order. And the capitals of the Ionic order they have these scrolls. So if you really want to tell the difference between Ionic and Doric order, just look at the capital. And if you see the scroll, that means you're looking at an Ionic order temple. And remember that all the statuary and relief was actually brightly painted. So these actually were not white temples. They were brightly painted. And obviously balance, clarity, symmetry were paramount in Greek temple design. And it really is kind of the history of the Greek architect struggling to find the perfect proportions, basically, for the temple. So the 2 basic systems that evolved were the Doric and the Ionic orders, like I talked about earlier. And the details and the parts of the building were a little bit different. The Doric order was formulated on the Greek mainland and was the preferred style in the Western colonies as well. And then the Ionic order was conceived in the Aegean Islands and the west coast of Asia Minor. So Athens did use the Ionic order, so it did have a little crossover. The styles did have, they weren't completely geographically, there was some crossover between the 2 areas a little bit, but for the most part, the Doric order was on the mainland and the Western colonies, and the Ionic was in the Aegean Islands and the Asia Minor. So both orders have columns resting on a stylobate, which is basically an elevated platform. And they actually did use metal clamps to hold a lot of the pieces of the temple together. They even used metal dowels in the columns to prevent them from shifting, although sometimes the columns were made from one piece of stone, but typically, they weren't. And there is a shaft here, as you can see, with the capital at the top. So the Doric order, the capitals are cushion-like and convex, and in the Ionic, they're scroll-like. So the entablature was typically in 3 parts, as we can see. So the archigrave is on the bottom, the frieze, and then we have the cornice on top of that. And the pediment is kind of the main area where they would fill that with sculpture in both orders. So both orders have the entablature split into 3 as well. In the Ionic order, the archigrave is divided into 3 horizontal bands. So you can see it's a little different than the Doric. And the Doric order tends to provide the frieze into triglyphs and metopes. So I believe this is the triglyph and this is the metope. For some reason that's not in this slide. And that's where they would put some of their sculpture decoration, is in the metopes of the Doric order. Like I said earlier, in the Ionic, they put their sculpture just all over in the frieze because it wasn't divided up. So the Doric order is typically described as being massive and heavy in appearance, and the Ionic order is lighter, more decorative, and the columns are more slender as well in the Ionic order. So now that we've gone over the differences in the Ionic order, we'll take a look at one of our first temples, an early temple, I guess. And it's found in Paestum, Italy, which is a Greek settlement. And this is a huge archaic temple, and it's done in the Doric order. You can look at the capitals. There's no scrolls there. They're a little bit more squished looking than some of the other temples that we'll look at in the Doric order, but it's definitely Doric. And it was built around 550 BCE, and it has that single pectoral colonnade, and the roof and the pediment are now gone. And this is a shrine to the goddess Hera, and it's known as the Temple of Hera I. And we'll look at the plan here. It's a little different than other archaic temples. It actually has a central row of columns running down the cella, which they think may have helped to support the roof, but it also may have split up the cella into a side for Zeus and a side for Hera. So it might have actually been dedicated to 2 gods instead of 1. But anyway, the fact that they added in this central row made it so that the proportions of the building were a little bit different. It made it so that there were 3 columns in ante right here, which is the 3 columns in the porch area, the Pronatos. Columns in antis basically is what these are called. Usually there were 2, but in this one there were 3 because they made it a little different. This is just a different layout, really. And they thought that those columns down the ridge beam would have helped to support the roof. So it made it so that the building had an odd number of columns on its end. And there were also 3 columns in antis, and it ruled out the central doorway for viewing the statue within the cella. So there's a doorway here and a doorway here, instead of one big central doorway. And like I said earlier, Zeus and Hera might have been divided up for that reason, because it was for 2 gods potentially. And the temple's columns they have that bulbous capital. And the shape of the column is a little different. They're wider in the middle, which makes them kind of cigar-shaped. And they're also very closely spaced. So it's just a little bit different than other examples that we'll look at. So next up, we'll look at the west pediment of the Temple of Artemis from Corfu, Greece, from around 600 to 580 BCE, and it's made out of limestone. So the pediment on the western side and the eastern side of this particular temple were exactly the same, the pediment design, but we're looking at the western side because it was in a little bit better shape. And the area of Corfu was an important stop on the trade route from the Greek mainland to the settlements in Italy. And it's a Doric order temple. It's one of the earliest examples we have of a Doric order temple. and it's made out of limestone instead of marble. And as you can see, this awkward triangle shape has shown a lot of difficulty for early sculptors. They weren't quite sure how to fill it, because it's 9 feet tall at its apex, but it gets increasingly smaller as you go along. So this is just a really good example of an early temple where sculptors are still trying to figure out how to treat this space. And so the central figure is Medusa. She is actually a gorgon, or a demon with a woman body and bird wings, and she has a hideous face and snake hair, and anyone that gazed at her would turn to stone. And she is pictured with her arms bent in a pinwheel shape, which is a visual convention used in the Archaic period to symbolize that she's actually flying. And then on either side of her are lions, and together these 3 figures basically serve as temple guardians. They're ferocious, which is something that we saw at the Lion Gate in Mycenae, but also in the Lamassu in Mesopotamia. And Medusa is, she's protecting the temple to ward off evil. And the configuration of Medusa and the lions on either side does recall a heraldic composition. So a symmetrical composition on either side of a central figure, basically, is what a heraldic composition is. And so we can see the outside influence of other cultures here. Lions are not native to Greece, so obviously that's from an outside culture. So we can see Medusa's children appear. They are in between Medusa and the lion figures, and they're smaller and broken off, but Chrysaor is at her left, and I think that's here. And then the winged Pegasus was here, and Pegasus is her child. And in the story, her children were born after she was slain. So narratively, this does not make any sense that she's being pictured next to her children, alive anyway. So the narrative content here is not accurate, and it's not what's important. Really what the artist is trying to do is show her children next to her to help you identify the figure better. So when it comes to the central figures, narration is not important, but narration is used on either side of the central figures. So this shows Zeus killing a giant, with a lightning bolt, and gigantomachy is actually the word for that, which is kind of the symbolization of, or the symbols of, good over evil, of the Greek culture over barbarians, order over chaos. Those kinds of things are what gigantomachy symbolizes, and it's used over and over again, and we'll see more of that later for sure. And we can actually see Achilles' son killing the enthroned king, the Trojan king here. We can't really see much of it because it's broken off. But it's showing signs of experimentation. There's a lack of narrative unity, and there's a diversity of scale seen in the figures. They're just really trying to fill in this awkward shape. Later pediments have figures that are all the same size, so this is definitely an early experimentation with that triangle shape and how to the sculptors are still trying to figure out how to fill that pediment area.